The shuttle doors hissed open, and David Reed stepped into the most beautiful prison he had ever seen. The Galactic Council chamber stretched before him like a frozen rainbow, its crystalline walls catching and splitting light into impossible colors. 5 massive thrones dominated the center, each one crafted from materials that hurt to look at directly. David had seen many wonders in his 53 years, but nothing quite like this. His worn military boots clicked against the polished floor as he walked forward, the sound echoing in the vast space. Every step reminded him why he was here, not as a conqueror or a diplomat, but as a witness to something the galaxy had forgotten. The 5 council members watched him approach. The luminal representative glowed with soft white light, its form shifting between solid and energy. Beside it sat an architect, a being of living crystal whose thoughts created tiny geometric patterns in the air. The collective spoke through 1,000 voices that somehow became one, while the ascended flickered between dimensions. Last was an eternal, currently wearing the shape of something vaguely human-like. David had studied them all, had fought their servants, had bled because of their lies. Human David Reed, the luminal's voice rang like distant music. You honor us with your presence. Honor. David almost smiled at that word. These beings knew nothing about honor. Thank you for accepting our invitation, he replied, his voice steady despite the weight of what was coming. The scars on his arms tingled under his formal jacket, hidden reminders of battles these gods pretended never happened. The ceremony began with words that meant nothing, trade agreements and cultural exchanges, territorial boundaries and resource allocations. Standard diplomatic theater. David played his part, nodding at appropriate moments, signing documents that would never matter. Then the youngest council member made a mistake. Honored Human, the small luminal beside the main throne, spoke with curiosity instead of protocol. We have heard that your species bears physical marks from conflicts. These scars on your hands and face, where did they come from? The chamber fell silent. Not the respectful quiet of formal proceedings, but the dead silence of held breath. David felt the weight of 5 ancient gazes pressing down on him. He could lie, should lie. It would be safer for everyone. Instead, he pushed up his sleeves. The scars ran from his wrists to his shoulders like a road map of violence. Burn marks from energy weapons, deep gouges from claws, twisted flesh where poison had eaten through skin. Each one told a story these gods had tried to erase. These? David's voice carried across the chamber like a funeral bell. These are from wars your gods pretend never happened. The young luminal tilted its glowing head, not understanding. But the elders understood perfectly. The architect's crystal form darkened. The collective's 1,000 voices whispered as one. The ascended stopped flickering and became terrifyingly solid. The eternal dropped its human disguise entirely. You speak of myths, the lead luminal said, but its voice had lost its musical quality. Ancient stories with no basis, in fact. David rolled up his other sleeve. More scars. More proof. Do myths leave plasma burns? Do stories tear flesh with real claws? He turned to face the full council now, no longer the respectful human diplomat. 200 years ago, your myths were begging my people to remember them, to tell their stories, to make sure someone knew they had existed. The architect leaned forward, its crystal body reflecting David's scarred image 1,000 times. You know nothing of galactic history, human. We have preserved peace for millions of years. Peace. David tasted the word like poison. Is that what you call it when you hunt the survivors? When you burn their worlds and call it natural disaster? When you erase entire species from existence? His hand moved to the collar of his jacket. Underneath lay the worst scar of all. A twisting mark that ran from his throat to his heart. The one that had nearly killed him. The one he had earned saving a ship full of children whose species the council claimed had been extinct for 1,000 years. These scars, David said, his voice growing stronger with each word, are proof that your perfect peace is built on lies. Every mark on my body tells the story of someone your gods tried to murder. The young luminal looked between the elders and David, finally beginning to understand. Its glow dimmed as realization dawned. The Void Wars, it whispered. The lead architect's crystal form cracked audibly. That name is forbidden. Forbidden, David nodded. Just like the species you call extinct. Just like the worlds you call empty. Just like the wars you call myths. He stepped closer to the thrones, no longer caring about protocol or safety. But myths don't leave scars. Myths don't bleed, and myths sure don't fight back. The chamber's beautiful light seemed to darken as the council members exchanged glances. David could see the calculations behind their ancient eyes. How much did this human know? How much had his species discovered? How dangerous had they become? You will speak no more of this, the collective commanded with its 1,000 voices. These fantasies serve no purpose. David smiled then, and it was not a pleasant expression. Fantasies? I have names. I have faces. I have recordings. He tapped his temple, and I have a very good memory. The Ascended flickered back into multiple dimensions, its form becoming terrifying to look at directly. You threaten the council? I'm not threatening anyone, David replied calmly. I'm just a scarred old soldier telling the truth about how he got hurt. The question is, what are you going to do about it? The silence stretched between them like a blade. 5 gods who had ruled the galaxy for eons faced one human who knew their darkest secret. One human whose body bore the evidence of their crimes. Finally, the Eternal spoke, its voice like grinding stone. Perhaps we should discuss this matter more privately. David shook his head. Privacy is how lies survive. Truth needs witnesses. He looked around the chamber, noting the recording devices, the monitoring systems, the diplomatic observers from a dozen species. All of them listening. All of them learning. These scars, he said again, rolling down his sleeves with deliberate care, are from wars your gods pretend never happened. But pretending doesn't make something untrue. It just makes you complicit. The young luminal's glow guttered like a dying flame. Even it was beginning to understand the weight of what David had just revealed. The perfect order of the galaxy. The peaceful history they had been taught. The benevolent gods who guided them all. Everything was built on a foundation of blood and lies. And one scarred human had just pulled out the first stone. David pulled out a small device and placed it on the crystalline floor. The hologram that emerged showed a young man in military uniform, barely 25, with clear skin and bright eyes. No scars yet. No knowledge of the darkness that waited between the stars. This was me 2 centuries ago, David said, his voice carrying the weight of all those years, when humanity first reached the outer rim and found the graveyard worlds. The council members remained frozen on their thrones, but David could see the tension in their forms. The architect's crystal body hummed with barely controlled energy. The collective's 1,000 voices had fallen to worried whispers. The hologram changed, showing a desolate planet surface covered in the twisted remains of massive structures. Buildings that had once touched the sky lay broken like the bones of giants, and scattered among the ruins, technology that glowed with impossible energies. We thought we had discovered lost treasure, David continued, his eyes never leaving the council. Ships that could fold space, weapons that could crack moons, medical devices that could heal any wound. We thought we were lucky explorers finding ancient ruins. He touched a control, and the image shifted to show a group of human scientists examining a strange, organic-looking machine. Their faces were full of wonder and excitement. Then we found the survivors. The new image made the young luminal gasp. It showed beings that looked like living shadows, their forms barely holding together, clustered around a failing power source in an underground chamber. They were clearly dying, their energy forms flickering like candles in the wind. The umbral, David said softly. Your histories claim they died out naturally 3,000 years ago. These ones had been hiding in that bunker for 2 millennia, keeping their children alive on scraps of energy, waiting for someone to remember they existed. The lead architect finally spoke, its voice like grinding stone. The umbral were primitive energy feeders. They could not adapt to galactic civilization. David's laugh was cold and bitter. Primitive? They built cities of living light that could house millions. They could travel between dimensions without ships. They were poets and philosophers and artists whose works made grown humans weep with their beauty. The hologram showed new images now, recordings of umbral settlements before their fall. Cities that seemed to be built from crystallized starlight. Beings of pure energy creating sculptures that defied physics. Libraries containing the collected wisdom of a species that had existed since before the council claimed dominion. But they had one fatal flaw, David continued. They remembered the real history of this galaxy. They knew about the wars, the genocides, the systematic elimination of any species that might challenge council authority. The collective's 1,000 voices rose to a roar. These are fabrications, propaganda created by terrorists and rebels. David nodded calmly. That's what they told us at first. Keep quiet, they said. Don't interfere with galactic politics. Accept our version of history, and Earth would be welcomed into the community of civilized worlds. The hologram changed again, showing a younger David in a military briefing room. Around him sat other humans, their faces grim as they listened to reports from the outer rim. More graveyard worlds, more survivors, more species that officially did not exist, but we kept finding them, David said. The deep singers whose music could make stars dance. Your records say they died in a plague. We found them hiding in the gravity wells of black holes, their voices keeping entire solar systems in harmony. New images flashed through the hologram, beings of impossible beauty singing to the cosmos itself, their voices creating patterns in space-time that human instruments could barely detect. The Stone Fathers, who could grow planets like gardens, according to you, they vanished when their home star went supernova. We found them on dead worlds, nursing tiny seedlings that would grow into continents, trying to rebuild what had been destroyed. The images showed massive beings made of living rock, their hands gentle as they tended to growths that would someday become forests and oceans. Their eyes held the wisdom of geological ages and the sadness of species that knew they were the last of their kind. The Void Dancers, who could step between galaxies like crossing a room. You say they transcended physical existence. We found them trapped in pocket dimensions, cut off from the cosmic winds that were their food and breath. Forms of pure motion flickered through the hologram, beings that seemed to exist in 7 dimensions at once, reaching through barriers that had been deliberately created to cage them. David's voice grew harder with each revelation. Every species we found told the same story. They had thrived once. They had built wonders that spanned star systems. They had achieved things the current galactic civilization could only dream of. And then the Council came, offering membership and friendship and guidance. The lead luminal's glow dimmed noticeably. We brought order to chaos. We ended the wars between primitive species. You ended the species themselves, David shot back, one by one. Those who submitted completely were allowed to survive as shadows of what they had been. Those who maintained their independence were marked for extinction. The hologram now showed battle footage, not the clean, bloodless conflicts of modern warfare, but desperate struggles in dying cities. Council fleets bombarding worlds while their inhabitants tried to flee. Refugee ships being hunted through space by vessels flying no flags and claiming no allegiance. This is what we found when we dug deeper, not just survivors, but records, testimonies. Proof that every extinct species in your histories died screaming while you watched. The images showed mass graves on a dozen worlds, entire civilizations reduced to ash and memory, art and literature and scientific achievements that had taken millennia to develop, wiped out in days of systematic destruction. And you know what the real crime was? David asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow filled the entire chamber. They trusted you. Every single species believed the Council's promises right up until the end. They thought you were gods. They thought you were there to help. The young luminal was openly weeping now, its form flickering with distress. The other council members sat in stunned silence, their carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of David's revelations. So humanity made a choice, David continued. We could accept the lies and live comfortable lives in your false paradise. We could pretend the survivors didn't exist and the graveyard worlds were natural disasters. We could take our place among the sheep and forget we had ever seen the wolves. He smiled then, and it transformed his scarred face into something fierce and proud. Or we could remember. We could bear witness. We could make sure that when the last umbral died, someone would know they had lived. When the final deep singer fell silent, someone would carry their music. When the Stone Father's gardens finally withered, someone would plant new seeds in their memory. The hologram changed one last time, showing human ships moving through deep space, their holds full of refugees from species that officially did not exist. David's younger self was there, helping carry injured void dancers to medical bays, his uniform already bearing the first scars of battles the Council claimed never happened. These marks on my body, David said, rolling up his sleeves again, are not just from wars your gods pretend never happened. They are from the choice my species made to remember what you wanted us to forget. They are proof that some lies are too big to swallow, even when swallowing them would be safe. The chamber fell silent except for the sound of the young luminal's distressed energy fluctuations. 5 gods who had ruled the galaxy through carefully maintained lies faced one human who had spent 2 centuries collecting the truth they had tried to bury. And in that silence, David smiled like a man who had finally found the words he had been looking for his entire life. David began unbuttoning his formal jacket, his movements deliberate and calm. The council watched in growing alarm as more scars became visible, each one a story they had hoped would never be told. "You want to know about these marks?" he asked, his voice steady as granite. "Let me tell you about the war you've been pretending doesn't exist for 150 years. He rolled up his left sleeve completely, revealing burns that spiraled around his forearm like twisted ribbons. The flesh had healed strangely, leaving patterns that seemed to shift in the chamber's crystalline light. "Refuge Station Alpha," David said, touching the largest burn. "A medical facility we built in the outer dark to treat survivors from the graveyard worlds. Your peacekeepers found it in 2387. They came in unmarked ships firing on hospital transports and refugee shelters. The holographic display shifted to show a space station under attack. Sleek council vessels, their identification markers scrubbed clean, poured energy beams into docking bays filled with fleeing civilians. David's younger self could be seen dragging wounded Umbral through corridors filled with superheated plasma. "I held a power conduit for 3 hours while evacuations continued," David continued, flexing his scarred arm. "The feedback burns went to the bone. But we saved 8,000 beings that day. 8,000 witnesses your gods wanted erased." The young Luminol stared at the images in horror. "But those are council ships. We would never attack medical facilities." David's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Would never? Or just never admit it?" He pointed to another scar, this one running along his jaw. "Kepler Station, Shellerpia 94. Your collective sent infiltrators to poison our food supplies. This is from the antidote synthesis. My partner died making enough cure for the refugees we were protecting." The collective's 1,000 voices rose in denial. "The collective does not engage in assassination or sabotage." "The collective doesn't engage in anything directly," David replied. "Just like the architects don't build weapons, just provide technical specifications. The Luminols don't order attacks, just share intelligence. The Ascended don't kill anyone, just accidentally collapse dimensional barriers around refugee camps. And the Eternals never lie. They just wear different faces when they commit their crimes." He turned to show his back, pulling his shirt aside to reveal a network of claw marks that ran from his shoulders to his spine. The wounds had healed into raised ridges that formed an almost artistic pattern across his skin. "The Predator cast," David said simply. 2401. "We were evacuating the last survivors from Andromeda Minor when your hunting parties arrived. You called them primitive beasts driven by instinct. But they spoke 12 languages and wrote poetry between kills. They hunted thinking beings for sport, because that was what their council masters had trained them to do. The hologram showed creatures that moved like living nightmares, their forms shifting between elegant beauty and savage violence. They stalked through human defensive lines with intelligence and purpose, their attacks coordinated and precise. They cornered me in the refugee quarters," David continued, his voice distant with memory. 47 children from 6 different extinct species, huddled together while monsters played with their food. I held them off for 11 minutes until reinforcements arrived. The scars on his back seemed to pulse with remembered pain. 11 minutes. 47 lives. Worth every mark they left. The Eternal leaned forward, its current form rippling with agitation. "You make accusations without proof. These could be injuries from any conflict." David smiled and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small crystal, its surface covered in microscopic etchings that seemed to move in the light. "Proof?" He placed the crystal on the floor and activated it. "This is a memory crystal from a dying architect on Vega 7, one of your own people, recording what happened to his colony in 23M56. The crystal projected images directly into their minds, bypassing their optical senses entirely. The council members jerked back as they experienced the memories firsthand, feeling the terror and confusion of architects, watching their own kind arrive with weapons of mass destruction. Your people were told they were primitive. Separatists. The dying architect's voice echoed in their heads. They were told we had refused to evolve, refused to accept guidance. But we were the ones who remembered the old ways, who knew how the council really gained power, so we had to die." David touched another scar, this one a perfect circular burn on his chest. "I tried to save that colony. Energy weapon at close range. tore right through my armor and cooked my heart. I was clinically dead for 4 minutes while human medics tried to restart my systems. He pulled out more crystals, more memory cores, more evidence of atrocities the Council had spent centuries covering up. With each new revelation, the young luminal's glow grew dimmer, its form flickering with distress. "The Shadow Campaign," David said, placing the crystals in a precise circle around him. "That's what we called it. Not because we were hiding, but because your crimes existed in the shadows of official history. Every time we saved someone you wanted dead, you rewrote the records. Every time we exposed your lies, you created new ones to cover them." The crystals began resonating with each other, their combined light creating a three-dimensional map of the galaxy. But this wasn't the clean, organized galaxy of Council records. This was a galaxy of hidden colonies and secret bases, of refugee fleets moving through unmarked space, of underground networks that spanned star systems. "For 150 years, David said, his voice growing stronger with each word, humanity has been fighting a war the Council refuses to acknowledge. We've lost millions of people protecting beings you claim never existed. We've sacrificed our own expansion, our own development, our own safety to keep your victims alive." The map showed human ships everywhere, tiny points of light in the darkness between Council systems. Some were hospital ships treating wounded refugees. Others were supply vessels carrying food and medicine to hidden colonies. Many were patrol craft standing guard against Council hunters who flew under false flags. "We could have been a great power by now," David continued. "We could have built an empire, conquered worlds, claimed our place among the galaxy's rulers. Instead, we chose to be gardeners, tending to the seeds of civilizations you tried to salt into sterile Earth." He pointed to a scar that ran along his collarbone, barely visible but clearly deliberate in its placement. 2435, the liberation of Echo Base. Your luminal strike teams had cornered the last survivors of the Deep Singers, beautiful, glowing beings who thought they were facing angels of mercy, right up until the energy blasts started cutting them down. The young luminal made a sound like breaking glass. "We are beings of light and peace. We do not make war on innocents." "You don't make war," David agreed. "You make extinctions. Clean, efficient, and always with perfect justification in your records." He touched the scar gently. "This one came from a child deep singer. Couldn't have been more than 50 standard years old. Barely past their first molting. She sang to me while I carried her to the evacuation ships. Sang about stars that remembered when her people flew free between galaxies." David's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but his voice never wavered. "She died in my arms 3 days later. Her song just stopped. And somewhere in your perfect archives, there's a report about a successful counter-terrorism operation against dangerous energy parasites." The crystal's light grew brighter as more memories began playing simultaneously. Hundreds of battles, thousands of rescue operations, millions of beings saved from systematic extermination. And in every recording, human soldiers bore fresh scars from conflicts that officially never happened. "Each mark on my body represents a choice," David said, looking directly at each council member in turn. "The choice to remember instead of forget. The choice to act instead of ignore. The choice to bleed for someone else's children instead of living safely with our own." He spread his arms wide, showing every scar, every burn, every mark of violence his body carried. "These scars are proof that some things are worth fighting for, even when fighting means standing against gods. They are proof that humanity chose to be human instead of safe." The chamber fell silent except for the soft humming of the memory crystals. 5 ancient powers who had ruled through carefully managed truth faced the overwhelming evidence of their systematic lies. And one scarred human stood in the middle of it all, his body a living testament to the wars they pretended never happened. The young luminal finally found its voice, though it shook like leaves in a storm. "How many?" it whispered. "How many species still survive?" David smiled, and for the first time since entering the chamber it was the expression of pure joy. "More than you can imagine," he said, "and every single one of them remembers who helped them survive." David reached into his inner jacket pocket and withdrew something that made the entire council recoil. It was a simple object no larger than his fist, but it pulsed with energies that seemed to bend space around it. The crystalline chamber's lights dimmed as if afraid to compete with its glow. "Do you know what this is?" David asked, holding the object carefully in both hands. The scars on his palm seemed to ache in its presence, old wounds remembering older pain. The lead architect's crystal form cracked audibly. Impossible. Those were all destroyed. A divine core, David said softly. The heart of a creator engine, capable of building worlds or unmaking them. Your histories claim these artifacts are myths, religious symbols with no basis in reality. He smiled grimly. This one came from the homeworld of the Starweavers. Right before your fleets glassed the entire system, the memory crystals around him began resonating with the core's energy, their projections becoming more vivid, more real. The council chamber filled with images of beings of impossible beauty, their bodies made of crystallized starlight, their hands shaping matter at the atomic level. The Starweavers were old when your species were still crawling in primordial mud. David continued. They built the first hyperspace lanes, created the dimensional gateways that made galactic civilization possible. Every piece of technology you claim as divine gift was stolen from their dying hands. The Ascended flickered violently between dimensions. The Starweavers transcended physical existence eons ago. They ascended to a higher plane of being. David's laugh was cold as vacuum. Ascended? Is that what you call it when you trap an entire species in a dimensional prison and harvest their creative energy for 10,000 years? He activated the core, and suddenly the chamber was filled with screaming. Not audible screams, but the psychic death cries of a civilization being murdered. The council members writhed on their thrones as they experienced the final moments of the Starweavers, felt their desperate confusion as beings they trusted as allies revealed themselves as predators. They thought you were friends, David said, his voice cutting through the psychic agony. Right up until the end, they believed you had come to help them transcend their physical limitations. Instead, you chained them between dimensions and fed on their ability to create. The screaming stopped, but the echoes lingered in their minds. The young luminal was curled in a ball of distressed light, its form barely holding together. Every miracle in your perfect civilization, David continued, every wonder that makes other species worship you as gods, is built on the corpses of people who trusted you. He gestured to the memory crystals, and new images began playing. Council fleets arriving at peaceful worlds with offers of membership and protection. Smiling diplomats explaining the benefits of joining the galactic community. Scientists and scholars eager to share their knowledge with these magnificent beings from the stars. And then the slow strangulation. Technologies gradually restricted. Knowledge carefully controlled. Independence systematically dismantled. Until the choice became simple: complete submission or complete extinction. The Harmony Builders created music that could heal wounded minds and mend broken souls, David said, touching a scar on his neck. Your collective absorbed their entire species during a concert meant to celebrate galactic unity. Billions of beings, all dissolved into your hive mind while they were singing songs of peace. The collective's 1,000 voices tried to speak at once, creating a cacophony of denial and justification. David waited until they fell silent, then continued. The Time Gardeners could see across centuries, helping species avoid disasters and plan for sustainable futures. The Eternals wore their faces while committing genocide against their rival prophets, then claimed their predictions as divine revelation. The Eternals' current form rippled and changed, cycling through dozens of shapes in obvious distress. Some were recognizable as council species, but others were alien forms that no longer existed anywhere in the galaxy. The world's singers grew planets like flowers, each one a unique masterpiece of life and beauty. The architects studied their techniques for millennia, then cracked their worlds like eggs to steal the seeds of creation. The lead architect's crystal body was now spider-webbed with fractures, its harmonic resonance fluctuating wildly. We preserved their knowledge. Their techniques live on through us, and their techniques, David spat, pale imitations of true artistry, practiced by thieves who murdered the teachers. He activated another memory crystal, showing worlds of impossible beauty being systematically destroyed, their life-giving cores extracted like organs from a living body. And the luminals, David said, turning to face the beings of light directly. The peaceful, enlightened luminals who never make war. His voice dripped with contempt. Do you want to know how you really achieved your transcendence of physical matter? The lead luminal's glow flickered. We evolved naturally over millions of years. David pulled up his shirt, revealing the worst scar of all. It ran from his throat to his heart, a twisted channel of destroyed flesh that pulsed with its own inner darkness. The council members recoiled from it as if it were a wound in reality itself. The void touched, David said simply. Beings of pure darkness who fed on negative energy, transforming pain and suffering into something beautiful and healing. They were your opposites in every way, and you envied them for it. The memory crystal showed creatures that seemed to be made of living shadow, but their darkness was warm and comforting, like a gentle night that promised rest after a long day. They moved through hospitals and battlefields, drawing out pain and trauma, transforming anguish into peace. You couldn't understand how darkness could heal while your light only illuminated, David continued. So you declared them parasites, enemies of all enlightened life. You hunted them through black holes and dark nebulae, cornering them in the spaces between spaces. The scar on his chest began to glow with dark fire, responding to the memories. I was there when you found the last pod of their children. Nursery worlds hidden in the shadow of dying suns, where the young ones learned to transform sorrow into joy. The images showed beings of light descending on worlds of gentle darkness, their radiance not illuminating but burning, destroying the careful balance that allowed shadow and light to coexist. You didn't just kill them, David said, his voice breaking slightly. You consumed them, absorbed their power, their ability to heal, their connection to the darkness that gives meaning to light. That's how you transcended matter, by murdering your opposite and stealing their essence. The lead luminal's form was flickering now, unstable and chaotic. We brought order to chaos. We ended the suffering they caused. They ended suffering, David corrected. You just moved it somewhere else. He touched his scar again. This came from the last adult void touched, defending her children. She could have killed me with a thought, dissolved me into shadow and memory. Instead, she marked me. The scar pulsed brighter, and suddenly the chamber was filled with visions of what the galaxy had been like before the Council's rise. Worlds where light and darkness danced together in perfect harmony. Species that had learned to transform their pain into wisdom, their fears into strength, their losses into deeper love. She marked me, so I would remember, David whispered. So someone would know that healing came from embracing darkness as well as light, not from pretending shadows don't exist. David stood now in the center of the chamber, surrounded by evidence of crimes that spanned millions of years. The memory crystals cast their light on his scarred form, each mark a testament to the truth the Council had tried to bury. You call yourselves gods, he said, his voice carrying the weight of all those lost civilizations. But gods create. They don't just steal and destroy and pretend they invented what they stole. He held up the divine core, its light casting strange shadows on the walls. This is what creation looks like. The power to build something from nothing, to give life where there was only void. The council members sat frozen on their thrones, ancient beings finally confronted with the full weight of their accumulated sins. But you know what? David smiled, and it was terrible to see. Gods bleed too. We've proved that already. Every time one of your unmarked ships didn't come home. Every time one of your perfect operations went wrong. Every time you found resistance where you expected submission. He pointed to each council member in turn. You bleed information when your lies are exposed. You bleed credibility when your victims survive to tell their stories. You bleed power when species refuse to worship their murderers. The young luminal managed to speak, its voice barely a whisper. What do you want from us? David looked at the small being with something approaching pity. I want my friends back. I want the species you murdered to walk among the stars again. I want the children I've held while they died to grow up and build something beautiful. His voice hardened. But what I want and what I can get are different things. He gathered the memory crystals, their light dimming as he deactivated them one by one. What I can get is the truth. What I can get is an end to the lies. What I can get is a galaxy that finally knows what its gods are really made of. The divine core pulsed one final time, and David tucked it back into his jacket. You asked how I got my scars. Now you know. They're proof that your perfect order has cracks in it. They're evidence that some fights are worth having, even against gods. He turned toward the chamber's exit, his footsteps echoing in the silence. And most importantly, they're a promise that humanity remembers what you've forgotten, that someone still cares about the species you've erased, that your victims have allies you never expected. David paused at the threshold, looking back at the 5 beings who had ruled the galaxy through lies and murder. Gods bleed, he said simply. And when enough people know that, they stop being gods. The first sign that everything had changed came from the youngest luminal. Its glow had stabilized into something David had never seen before, a light that pulsed in rhythm with ancient songs the Council claimed never existed. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonies that belonged to the deep singers. The transmission, it whispered, staring at readouts that suddenly meant something different. Your testimony. It wasn't just being recorded here. David smiled as alarms began wailing throughout the crystalline chamber. The Council's perfect monitoring systems were detecting something impossible. Communications were flooding in from across the galaxy, broadcasts in languages that had been extinct for millennia, signals from coordinates that showed empty space on official star charts. Every hidden colony, David said calmly as chaos erupted around him. Every refugee fleet, every survivor we've protected for 2 centuries. They've all been listening. The architect's crystal form shattered completely, then reformed into something angular and desperate. This is impossible. We track all communications. We monitor all space. You monitor the space you know about, David corrected. The space you allow to exist in your perfect records. But there's a lot of galaxy between the stars, and we've been using it for a very long time. The main display screens around the chamber flickered to life, showing transmission sources lighting up across the galactic map. But this wasn't the clean, organized galaxy of Council records. Signals were coming from dark nebulae, from the gravity wells of black holes, from the spaces between spiral arms where no life was supposed to exist. And every signal carried the same message, broadcast in the ancient languages of species the Council had spent eons trying to forget. We remember. We survive. We rise. The collective's 1,000 voices screamed in unison. This is rebellion. This is chaos. We will restore order. Order? David laughed as more alarms joined the symphony of panic. Look around you. This is what happens when order is built on lies. Eventually, the truth finds a way out. The transmission feeds were multiplying faster than the Council's systems could track them, ancient umbral voices singing defiance from their hidden sanctuaries. Stonefather communities declaring their existence from worlds the Council thought they had sterilized, void dancers stepping out of their dimensional prisons, their forms casting impossible shadows across space itself. 200 years, David said, watching the displays with satisfaction. 200 years of careful preparation. Hidden colonies connected by communication networks you never suspected. Refugee populations that grew into thriving communities. Survivors who had children and taught them to remember what their grandparents had lost. The young luminol was transfixed by the displays, its form shifting between its natural glow and the darker harmonies it was somehow channeling. The Starweavers, it breathed. There are Starweavers still alive, David nodded. Not many, but enough, hidden in pocket dimensions, keeping their knowledge alive through the most patient children in the galaxy, waiting for the day when they could build again instead of just surviving. The Eternal had abandoned all pretense of maintaining a stable form, cycling rapidly through shapes that belonged to species listed as extinct in every official record. You've doomed them all, it snarled. The moment they reveal themselves, our fleets will hunt them down and finish what we started. Will they? David asked mildly. He touched a control on his jacket, and the chamber's main screen switched to a different view. Space around the neutral star system was no longer empty. Ships materialized out of quantum shadow and dimensional fold, emerging from hiding places that had kept them invisible for centuries. But these weren't just human vessels. The fleet that surrounded the Council chamber was the impossible mixture of technologies and designs, ships that had been built by species working together in ways the Council's rigid hierarchy had never imagined. Umbral energy signatures powered architect crystal hulls. Stonefather gravity manipulation guided vessels with deep singer harmonic drives. Void dancer phase technology protected ships that flew using principles the Council had thought safely buried with their creators. The refugees you tried to exterminate, David said, watching the Council members stare in horror at the display. They didn't just survive. They thrived. They learned from each other. They built something new. The fleet wasn't just a collection of survivors. It was proof that cooperation between species could create something greater than any individual civilization. Technologies that had taken millions of years to develop separately had been combined and improved, creating vessels that outclassed anything in the Council's perfect fleets. The Ascended flickered frantically between dimensions, trying to call for reinforcements. Our response fleets will crush this rebellion within hours, You cannot stand against the accumulated might of galactic civilization. David's smile widened. About those response fleets. The tactical displays switched to show Council space, and the ancient being's confidence finally cracked completely. Their perfect military installations were going dark one by one. Not destroyed, but simply abandoned. Ships that had served the Council for millennia were powering down their weapons and broadcasting surrender signals. Turns out, David said conversationally, a lot of your loyal species have been asking questions about their own histories. Questions about why certain records are classified. Questions about what happened to their ancestral colonies. Questions about why their greatest heroes and artists all seem to have died in convenient accidents. The young luminal was glowing brighter now, its form stabilizing into something that was both itself and something older. The illuminated archives, it whispered. We always wondered why so many files were restricted. Why our early history had so many gaps. Your people aren't stupid, David said gently. None of them are. They just trusted their leaders to tell them the truth. But once they started seeing evidence, more fleets were appearing on the displays now. Not the mixed refugee vessels, but pure Council ships flying under new banners. Luminal light cruisers broadcasting messages of support for the survivors. Architect construction ships abandoning their perfect projects to help rebuild destroyed worlds. Even collective hive ships were breaking away from central control. Their thousand voices choosing independence over unity. This is impossible, the lead architect insisted, its reformed crystal body ringing like a cracked bell. Our species are loyal. Our people understand the necessity of order. Your people understand that they've been lied to for millions of years, David corrected. And they're choosing to do something about it. The chamber shook as massive ships took position around the crystal structure. But these weren't attack formations. They were protective formations. Refugee fleets and defecting Council ships working together to create a shield around the neutral station. You see, David said, his voice carrying easily over the sound of alarms and panicked communications. The thing about building a civilization on lies is that it only works as long as everyone believes them. Once the truth gets out, once people start asking questions, the whole structure comes apart. The collective was broadcasting on all frequencies now, trying to maintain control of its hive ships through sheer force of will. But its thousand voices were fragmenting, individual components choosing to think for themselves for the first time in eons. We offered peace, it screamed. We brought order to chaos. We ended the wars between primitive species. You ended the species themselves, came a new voice. The chamber's communication system had been hijacked. And suddenly the Council was hearing directly from the beings they had tried to eliminate. An umbral survivor spoke first, her voice like distant starlight. We were artists and philosophers seeking truth through living light. You called us parasites and hunted us through dark space. A stone father's rumbling bass followed. We were gardeners and builders, growing worlds with patience and love. You called us obstacles and shattered our gardens. Deep singer harmonies joined the chorus. We were musicians and healers, weaving songs that could mend broken souls. You called us dangerous and silenced our voices. More voices joined in. Dozens and then hundreds of species thought extinct, each one telling their story to a galaxy that had forgotten they existed. The communication networks that had hidden them for centuries were now broadcasting their testimonies to every world in Council space. We remember, they said together, their voices creating harmonies that had been silent for millennia. We survived. We learned. We forgave our murderers because forgiveness is stronger than hatred. But we never forgot. David listened to the growing chorus with tears in his eyes. These were the voices he had fought to preserve, the songs he had bled to protect. After 2 centuries of hiding and surviving, they were finally free to speak their truth to the galaxy. And now, he said, turning back to the Council members, you get to make a choice. The same choice you offered to every species you encountered. Submit to the new order or be swept away by it. The young luminal rose from its throne, its light now a complex mixture of its natural glow and the deeper harmonies it had inherited from forgotten ancestors. What do you want us to do? David looked at the small being with something approaching hope. Learn, he said simply. Listen to the voices you tried to silence. Understand what was lost when your ancestors chose power over truth, and help us build something better. The chamber fell quiet except for the ongoing transmissions from across the galaxy. 5 gods who had ruled through lies faced the evidence of their crimes and the choice of their redemption. Outside, the greatest fleet in galactic history waited for their answer. Inside, one scarred human stood as witness to the moment when the universe finally learned to remember what it had lost. 20 years later, David knelt in soil that had never known war. His hands weathered now with age rather than just scars, carefully tended seedlings that represented 100 different worlds. Around him grew a garden that would have been impossible before the awakening. When truth had finally conquered the careful lies of millennia, the flowers sang soft harmonies as they swayed in the breeze, their melodies learned from deep singer refugees who had taught them to transform sunlight into music. Crystal formations grew between the rows, their geometric patterns designed by architect engineers working alongside stonefather gardeners to create art that was both beautiful and functional. Shadow pools reflected light that wasn't quite light, spaces where void-touched children could play safely while luminal youngsters learned that darkness was not something to be feared but embraced. "Grandfather, David," a small voice called, in the musical language that had become standard across the galaxy, a tongue that borrowed syntax from extinct civilizations and pronunciation from species thought lost forever. "The memorial is ready for your inspection." David looked up from his plants to see a child who embodied everything the new galaxy had become. Her mother was human. Her father a reformed collective individual who had chosen independence over hive-mind unity. But she carried genetic memories from a dozen species, gifts shared freely by survivors who wanted their knowledge to live on in the children of tomorrow. "Thank you, little star," David said, using the name that had stuck despite her official designation. He rose carefully, his body protesting the movement in ways that had nothing to do with his battle scars and everything to do with the simple passage of time. The memorial stood at the center of New Harmony, the city that had grown around the former council chamber. The crystalline structure had been transformed into something beautiful and functional, its walls now transparent to show the truth instead of hiding it. At its heart stood a monument that hurt to look at directly, not because it was too bright or too alien, but because it contained too much memory. Every species that had been erased was represented there, not just in names or symbols but in living memory crystals that preserved their voices, their art, their final words before extinction. Visitors could touch the memorial and experience what had been lost, feel the weight of civilizations that had died trusting in false gods. But surrounding the memorial were other monuments, smaller ones, dedicated to those who had fought to preserve what the council tried to destroy. Human names were carved alongside umbral song patterns and stonefather garden maps. The memorial to the lost was balanced by celebration of those who had refused to let them be forgotten. David's name was there, along with his scars reproduced in living metal that told their stories to anyone who touched them. But he wasn't the only human honored. Thousands of men and women who had bled for strangers, died for principles, sacrificed their own safety to protect species they had never met. "The Remembrance Council is waiting," Little Star said, her voice carrying the patience that came from being raised by people who understood that some things were worth waiting for. David nodded and followed her toward the chamber, noting the changes that had been made over the decades. Where once 5 thrones had dominated the space, now there were circles of seats arranged in spirals that allowed every voice to be heard equally. Representatives from hundreds of species gathered here not to rule but to remember, to ensure that the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. The original council members were still there, but transformed by 20 years of truth. The young luminal had become something new, its light now carrying the harmonies of species that had nearly been lost forever. It served as a voice for the extinct, helping the galaxy understand what had been destroyed and why it mattered. The architect had rebuilt itself into something beautiful and humble, its crystal form now incorporating materials from every world the Stone Fathers had grown. It worked tirelessly to repair the damage that had been done, growing new planets to replace those that had been destroyed, always asking permission instead of simply taking what it needed. The collective had fragmented into thousands of individuals, each one learning to think independently, while still maintaining connection to their siblings. They served as living libraries, preserving the memories of extinct species in their enhanced minds, ensuring that no knowledge would ever be lost again. The Ascended had chosen to remain in physical reality, using its dimensional abilities to search the spaces between spaces for any survivors who might still be hiding. It moved through quantum shadows and parallel dimensions, calling to those who had learned to distrust even the concept of rescue. The Eternal had stopped changing shape altogether, choosing to wear the form of the last species it had helped to exterminate. It carried their appearance as both memorial and penance, a living reminder of what had been lost when lies became more important than truth. David Reed, the young luminal, spoke as he entered the chamber, its voice now carrying harmonies that had been silent for millennia. The galaxy gathers to honor those who chose truth over comfort, memory over forgetting, resistance over submission. David looked around the chamber, seeing faces from across the galaxy. Former refugees whose children now led thriving colonies, reformed council servants who had spent decades trying to atone for their participation in genocide, representatives from species that had been reborn from genetic samples and memory crystals, brought back from extinction by the combined efforts of science and determination. 20 years ago, the luminal continued, you stood in this chamber and asked us a simple question. You asked us to remember what we had chosen to forget. Today we gather to show you what that remembering has built. The displays around the chamber lit up, showing not the sterile perfection of the old council space, but a galaxy alive with diversity and growth. Former graveyard worlds bloomed with new life. Hidden colonies had emerged from the shadows to build cities that celebrated their unique cultures. Technologies that had been hoarded by the council were now shared freely, allowing species to develop in ways that honored their own nature instead of conforming to imposed standards. The wars are over, a Stonefather representative rumbled, his voice like distant mountains. Not because opposition has been crushed, but because there is no longer anything to fight against. Truth has made conflict unnecessary. The children sing new songs, added a deep singer whose voice carried melodies that had been thought lost forever. Songs that remember the old harmonies while creating new ones. Songs that teach joy instead of sorrow, hope instead of despair. David listened to the testimonies, watching species work together in ways the rigid council hierarchy had never allowed. Former enemies collaborated on projects that benefited everyone. Knowledge flowed freely between civilizations. Art and music and literature bloomed in forms that had been impossible when cultural expression was carefully controlled. But there were empty spaces too. Species that were truly extinct. Civilizations that had been so thoroughly destroyed that not even genetic memory remained. The memorial crystals could preserve their voices, but they could not bring back what had been completely lost. We gather also to mourn, the reformed collective said, its individual voices speaking in harmony. To acknowledge that some wounds cannot be healed, some losses cannot be recovered. The galaxy is diminished by what was destroyed in the name of order. David nodded, feeling the weight of those losses in his bones. He had saved who he could, preserved what was possible, fought for every life that could be protected. But he had not been able to save them all. No one could have. The scars remain, he said finally, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. On my body, in our memories, in the spaces where civilizations once thrived. They remind us of what hatred and fear can destroy, of how easily lies can become more comfortable than truth. He stood slowly, his aged body protesting but his spirit as strong as ever. But scars also remind us that some things are worth fighting for. That resistance is possible even against gods. That truth, no matter how painful, is better than beautiful lies. The young luminal's light pulsed with ancient rhythms. What would you have us remember most, David Reed? What lessons should we carry forward to our children and their children? David smiled, thinking of Little Star and all the other children who would grow up in a galaxy where diversity was celebrated instead of suppressed, where differences were seen as strengths instead of threats, where truth was valued more than comfort. Remember that gods bleed, he said simply. Remember that no power is so great that it cannot be questioned, no authority so absolute that it cannot be challenged. Remember that the weak can become strong when they work together, and that lies always fall when enough people choose to tell the truth. He looked around the chamber one last time, seeing the faces of species that had been saved, civilizations that had been reborn, children who would never know the fear their ancestors had lived with. And remember that scars tell stories, David said, touching the marks on his hands that had started this journey so many years ago. They remind us where we've been, what we've survived, what we've learned. They are proof that some fights are worth having, even when the odds seem impossible. The chamber fell silent as David made his way back to the garden where he spent his days now, tending plants that grew impossibly well together, nurturing life that celebrated diversity instead of demanding conformity. Behind him, the galaxy continued its work of remembering and rebuilding. Ahead of him, flowers sang songs that had been silent for too long, their melodies promising that truth once awakened would never again be allowed to sleep. David knelt once more in soil that had never known war, his scarred hands gentle as they tended seedlings that would grow into a future worth fighting for. The wars your gods pretended never happened were finally over, not because they had been forgotten, but because they had been remembered so well that they could never happen again.